We've all paid taxes, but have you ever really stopped to think about who truly ends up bearing the cost? We're going to dig into this powerful 200-year-old idea from the economist David Ricardo, and I think it might just flip everything you thought you knew about taxes on its head.
I mean, it seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? If the government puts a tax on something, say gasoline, you'd think either the oil companies pay it or, we pay for it at the pump. But is it really that simple? Well, that's the big mystery we're going to unravel today.
All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, we need to step back in time. We're talking about 200 years ago, and we're going to look at the economy through the eyes of David Ricardo. See, he had this idea that to understand any economic event, like a new tax, you first have to know who the main players are on the field.
So what Ricardo did was he kind of boiled down the entire super complex economy into just 3 essential roles. Now look, it's a simplified model, for sure, but don't let that fool you. It's an incredibly powerful way to see how economic forces, ripple through an entire society.
So here they are, Ricardo's 3 key players. First up, you've got the landlord. Pretty simple. They own the land, they collect rent. Then there's the capitalist. This is the person who owns the factory or the farm, provides all the tools and machinery, the capital, and they're in it for the profit. And finally, you have the laborer, the one doing the physical work in exchange for wages. So you've got rent, profit, and wages. In Ricardo's model, those 3 things make up the entire economic pie.
Okay, so we've got our players on the board. Now let's throw a wrench in the works. Let's introduce a tax. But not just any tax. A tax on a basic necessity. Something everyone needs just to survive.
So let's imagine the government decides to put a tax on, let's say, corn. Something everyone eats. And they collect it directly from the farmer. Now, this is really important. This isn't a tax on some fancy luxury item. It's a tax on daily bread, basically. And that specific choice is what kicks off this powerful, fascinating chain reaction.
You see, a tax is almost never just a simple transaction between one person and the government. It's more like tossing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread out and they end up affecting everyone. So let's trace those ripples.
Okay, so here's how it all plays out step by step. First, the government taxes the corn. That makes corn more expensive, which means the price of food goes up for everybody, right? So now the laborer who's just trying to get by on their wages suddenly can't afford to eat. They have no choice but to demand higher pay just to survive. And who do you think has to pay those higher wages? Yep, the capitalist. So that tax, it gets passed along like a hot potato, and it lands right in the lap of the capitalist, hitting their profits.
Let's just look at the bottom line here for the capitalist. Before the tax, things were pretty good. They had a healthy profit margin. But after the tax, their cost of labor just shot up because they have to pay those higher wages. And the result? That profit margin gets totally squeezed. They're the ones who ultimately lose economic power in this whole scenario.
In this quote from Ricardo, well, it just perfectly sums up the entire argument. A tax on necessities will raise the wages of labor and therefore lower the profits of stock. It's so clear, right? You tax something people need to live, wages have to go up so they don't starve. And that money for higher wages, it has to come from somewhere. It comes directly out of the capitalists' profits from their stock, their business investment.
And this brings us right to the absolute core idea here, what we call the real burden of a tax. Look, it's not about who physically writes the check to the government. That's not what matters. It's about which group's economic power is actually worse off when all the dust settles. In our little story, even though the tax was technically on the farmer's corn, the real burden, it fell squarely on the capitalist.
Okay, so I know what you might be thinking. This is a 200-year-old theory about landlords and corn. Why should we care about this today? Well, here's why. Because the fundamental principle of how a tax burden shifts and ripples through an economy, that's absolutely timeless.
So let's really break down the big takeaways here, because this is where this old idea gets really relevant. First, who the government aims a tax at isn't always who ends up paying. Think about a corporate tax. It might sound like it's just on the company, but this theory shows how that cost can get passed on to you through higher prices, or to employees through lower wages. Second, taxes on necessities, things we all need, create these huge ripple effects. A gas tax is a perfect example. It doesn't just cost you more at the pump, it raises the shipping cost for literally everything you buy. Third, the tax burden tends to get shifted around until it lands on the person or group with the least power to pass it on again. And finally, understanding all this is just crucial if you want to have a real intelligent conversation about any tax policy today, whether it's income tax, sales tax, you name it.
So I want to leave you with this question.
The next time you hear a debate about a new tax, whether it's on corporations, on gas, on anything at all, just stop and ask yourself, based on what we just talked about, who really pays for it? Because as we've seen, the answer is almost never as simple as it looks.